All right, Jan, you ready to do it?
Ready to do it.
All right, here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Very excited to have back Jan Winhall. Jan, welcome.
Thank you, Guy.
All right. So
Great
Jan
to be here.
I am so excited for you to be here. Jan began her career as a social worker and psychotherapist 40 years ago. She began listening with non-pathologizing ears and heard shocking stories of sexual torture and responses that confused her. Initially, women were cutting themselves, binging and purging huge quantities of food, and abusing drugs and alcohol. As she listened, she learned that somehow these self-harming behaviors were helping, quote unquote, individuals to escape intolerable emotional states. They were shifting their mood from flooding anxiety to numbing deadness or vice versa. Because these behaviors were so helpful, they were compulsively repeated and often became addictions. Jan's book, Treating Addiction with the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model, bottom-up approach, is the result of rethinking the Felt Sense experience model that she wrote about in her book, Emerging Practice in Focusing-Oriented Psychotherapy in 2014. Jan has integrated the polyvagal lens theory to create a more sophisticated way of understanding emotional regulation, where addictive behavior is an embodied response to emotional dysregulation. All right. First off, before we tackle all of that, Jan, share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently, and then we'll dive in.
I'm originally born and raised in Toronto, Canada, and that's where I still am.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good place to be.
Pretty good. Pretty simple there. I mean,
yeah.
you were born there and you're there. All right, look, I am fascinated and inspired by you. I mean, you've been doing this for a while.
I have.
Okay. How did you get, what drew you, compelled you to get into this field?
Well, I used to answer that question, and I think I answered it with you 5 years ago by saying that it started with the group that I was leading of these young women who you just read about, who were incest survivors. And I started my career leading this group. It was the first job that I got. And I just listened. So it kind of went from there. But now I realize more and more that part of what led me to it, of course, was my own story. So I had my own story of trauma with folks, with family who were struggling to really try to take care of a new baby. And then when I was a teenager, I really fell madly in love, which I talk about in my book, but realized that years later that really what was happening was a relationship addiction. I was using this relationship, this early love, I think I was 16, to regulate myself. And then when I would drive this person crazy by overwhelming them with sympathetic energy and anxiety about them leaving, of course, they would feel suffocated and try to, shut down and get away from that. And that resulted in me feeling panicky.
Mm-hmm.
So that experience was what I carried in my body. And then when I got to this group, it resonated in there in terms of what was going on for me and trying to understand that. And then also that I got myself into therapy and luckily found a wonderful therapist who was so wise and insightful in terms of what we know today about psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
And so then somehow or other through that process, I wasn't in that state anymore of being dependent on somebody else to manage my sense of safety and grounding in my body. And I think those are the real roots of it. We all have that, right? There's something inside us. I think I read something about you had a brother, right, who went through the war. And it's these experiences that we carry in our body, these lived experiences that really inform our journey.
You said when you started that group or were in that group, you said you just listened. And oftentimes when young therapists are starting out, they don't just listen. what was it like for you initially? I mean, or in this,
Overwhelming.
yeah, I could imagine.
I developed vicarious trauma, but nobody talked about it back then. You know, I mean, one of the great things, right, about getting older is that you can really see how your field develops and grows and expands and changes over time. And 40 something years ago, boy, the face of trauma was very different than it is
Mm-hmm.
now. You know, people hardly talked about it really. And like me doing this group for young women who were incest survivors was virtually unheard of. Really. I mean, I just landed there because I was working at this hospital with people that were really curious about these kinds of things, and they started this program. And from there, I never bought into that particular kind of DSM pathologizing model.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't make any sense to me, and it felt profoundly disrespectful and misogynistic in the way that these women in particular were being treated. So I knew that wasn't right. I just knew in my body that's not the right way to be with people. And so that was a time with a lot of the work that was being done in the body was being done with feminist therapists who were just listening. You know, I don't know, do you remember The Courage to Heal? Mm-hmm. Ellen Bass and Laura Davis's work. And it was really discredited, you know, because they were seen as not being professional. They were, one of them was a writer. They were running writing groups. So they were listening to the stories that women were telling. And they were telling all these stories about sexual abuse, like Freud. You know, the same thing that happened with Freud listening to these stories, right? And so that's where I think that's the basis and the motivation, and I guess the passion that led me to try to figure out how this paradox existed, that these things that these young women were telling me that they were doing that hurt themselves, cutting the body, you know, drinking massive amounts of alcohol or using drugs or really unsafe sex. I mean, how do you understand that, right? Especially as a young person with no experience under my belt.
Right.
Even
Initially, it
things
sounds
like eating bars of soap. I was really confused, like how, and I knew that understanding it in terms of masochism wasn't right. It just that they weren't, there was too much in what they were sharing about how these behaviors were helping them.
all right. Say more.
So they didn't really get it either. But as we began to unpack it, what I would ask them, like, well, what happened? Tell me the sequence. What happened before and what happened after you cut yourself, your wrists or whatever. And so before would be often flooding behavior, right? We called it flooding and numbing. This was the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and dorsal, but we didn't have that language then. Mm-hmm. We just called it kind of embodied language, you know, flooding, getting overwhelmed. They can't bear the feelings. They would cut the body and then they would go to sleep often for a day or just not feel anything. And that was a relief.
I think, you know, some people, maybe a lot of people have heard of explanations of why there is some relief there, but what were you learning?
What I was learning had to do with how we understood what now these days we call, through polyvagal theory, the dorsal vagus, you know, the dissociated state that we knew quite a bit about back then. Those of us that were doing trauma work, we understood that people could go to different states and numb themselves. And so that made sense. And we started to work with that. And then I got really excited because in reading some of the early work actually of Bessel van der Kolk, he did these studies and also Judith Herman. They both recognized, Judith Herman called them jolts to the body, and that survivors would bring purposely these jolts to the body, and that it would help them to shift states, is basically what she was saying. I don't think she maybe used shift states as the language. That would be the language we would use today in polyvagal terms, right? And then Bessel van der Kolk was curious about it too, and did these studies that fascinated me when I read this. I started looking around for different people that were searching for this explanation. And what he found with war veterans, right, exposing them to violent films, and that their bodies actually excreted these endogenous opioids, which bring numbing and soothing to the body. And the amount of opioids that were excreted was about the same as what they would give you with severe physical pain if you went to emerge. I mean, isn't that remarkably wonderful that our bodies know how to do that? And this is the core of what I feel such a strong need to be a part of a movement of really changing the paradigm from this pathologizing DSM model into an embodied, really an ANS, an autonomic nervous system model of understanding how bodies carry this capacity to survive.
So say a little bit more about how the DSM is pathologizing specifically.
Well, I think when there's a lot of problems with reliability, right? Like when you try to take these ways of understanding behavior, and then you may have, and people do have the best of intentions. It's not like I think people are purposely trying to hurt. No, of course not. But I think that particular model of constructing behavior as kind of normal or disordered can't help but make a person feel like somehow, they're wrong in how they've responded, or they're bad in how they've responded, that it's not right. It's disordered. And even if you do that with a lot of compassion, it still it carries in the body this feeling of like, oh, it's totally different when you say to someone, wow, thank God your body knew how to adapt so you could survive something that is totally unbearable. You did that. Your body's wisdom did that. That brings what I call moments of liberation for people. You see the whole shift in their body. They move from sympathetic or dorsal dysregulating, nasty kind of feelings down into like, what? My body knew how to do that?
Right. I'm not bad. There's nothing wrong with me.
There's nothing wrong with me. I never use the word disordered, because even with the best of intentions, and I don't mean to make out anybody here to be a villain, it doesn't sit well in the body. And I don't think it's accurate. I think what is accurate is what we know from really moving from a more conceptual, cognitive oriented model that really doesn't pay attention to body process into what's starting to happen now more and more with trauma, of an embodied model of understanding and listening to what actually happens in your experience, and how does that help you? And when we shift into that paradigm, and I believe we're just on the cusp of starting to do that. We're not there yet, but I think people are really curious about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of what you're saying just makes me feel, not to sound simplistic, but good, empowered. There's so much of trust in the person sitting before you, the human being sitting before you. When you first, before you knew this, did you have a different attitude? Were you like, well, of course they've got to stop cutting, or of course they've got to stop binging, and of course that's not healthy for them, and obviously it's not, but did you understand that, okay, yes, it's unhealthy, but there's a reason why they're doing this?
I guess, maybe implicitly in my body, I understood that place of I have to do this or it feels like I'm not going to survive
Mm.
because of this early experience I had with addiction, right? But I also knew that it didn't last forever if I knew it through the therapy process that I went through, where I was allowed to kind of be really dependent on this person, to transfer from the kind of addictive relationship onto this person, to be reparented, and then to have this person really welcome my autonomy. And that happened for me in about a 7-year process as a teenager and early into my early adulthood, because I couldn't do it with my parents. They weren't able to give me that.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew that place, and I knew that it could change and heal, and it wasn't forever, and it wasn't a disease. I didn't feel like I was sick.
Mm-hmm.
I was struggling, but I didn't feel sick. I felt confused. So that model never suited me. And I don't know, I was maybe born a renegade anyway. The model also didn't suit me because I didn't like the way it was practiced. It was very top down, and it had a lot to do with, people in power defining experience of people that had less power. Right. And and marginalized groups. Oh my God, like it didn't feel right to me. So I was very drawn to, I was just curious, really being curious about why would a person do that? What's that about for you? And I also then, through that experience and starting to get more and more and digging into where people were talking about these physiological jolts to the body, I started to look for then more body-based therapy. And that's where I found Gendlin's work and focusing. Mm-hmm. And that was so beautiful and gentle. And it gave me this way of understanding the body, that the body knows the right steps forward if you give it what it needs. And what it needs is respect, acknowledgement, dignity, compassion. And that I also knew that we could give that to each other without being professionals.
There's a great quote by Gene Gendlin that I want to read here. Mm-hmm. And it's just amazing to me. And he says, the essence of working with another person is to be present as a living being. And that's lucky, because if we had to be smart or good or mature or wise, then we would probably be in trouble. But what matters is not that. What matters is to be a human being with another human being, to recognize the other person as another being in there. Yes. And that's what you're saying.
Yeah, Gene was my teacher.
That's incredible.
I knew Gene. I learned from Gene, and that's my favorite quote of his. That's in The Primacy of Human Presence, which is an absolutely, I use that whole quote in my book. It's actually quite long. And I use Gendlin's philosophy in my book to understand concepts through the body. Gendlin was a genius. And he said, all of our concepts. So again, if you go back to the DSM, all these concepts were constructed without the body. They were constructed up here in this post-Descartes cognitive-centric society that we live in. But we all know somewhere, Guy, that we have a body. Somewhere we know that
Right.
because we get hungry and we need to poop and we have sex and we get sick and we get COVID, and then, oh, we have a body. And now we're really getting that message, right?
Right. Let me ask you this. So, with the understanding that, everyone's different and every treatment is different and so forth, when you work with someone, and you might even want to draw from a particular experience, but when you work with someone and you're able to say to them and they're able to hear that there is nothing wrong with them, that it's amazing how they knew that they could help themselves by doing X or Y or Z, binging and so forth. What's the next step in terms, or what might be the next step in terms of therapy, treatment, healing?
Yeah. So it depends on what they're telling me is the problem. We can say the ways that you've responded to this are adaptive, whether it's developing addictions or multiplicity, right? Or dissociating a lot. These are all adaptive in a context in which you're not safe. But the problem is that you're suffering now because perhaps you have more safety to be able to shift out of these states of defense and move into something that feels grounding and calm and safer in the body. And it's actually promotes health and growth. So then let's talk about what's your problem? Like how is it manifesting? Well, I numb out all the time, or I'm drinking too much, or I have unsafe sex. And then, I have a very specific kind of way of managing that fits into a harm reduction model, really, if we're working with addiction. Yeah. So we'd look at, one of the things that I like that I talk about too in my book is this 3-circle model that Patrick Cairns has for working with addiction. And I fit that into a framework of the autonomic nervous system. And so the behaviors in that middle, the first circle, are the behaviors that you want to change. And we work with how can you do that in a way that is actually going to honor how you feel attached to this thing and slowly make it safe enough for you to be able to make some changes. The middle circle are the triggers that activate those behaviors, and that's also the sympathetic and dorsal branch of the vagus, right, of the autonomic nervous system. When we go into flight fight, we get activated to drink, or then we can shut down. So I see addictions as these ways of propelling back and forth in the autonomic nervous system. They're very efficient ways to shift from anxiety to numbing or back. So that's in the middle circle, those are the triggers that get you into trouble. And the outer ring of the 3 circles is the ventral branch of the vagus. It's living the good life. It's these practices that we do that I encourage people to do every day, whether it's singing, walking with your friend, holding your lover, playing the piano, yoga practice, psychotherapy, a focusing practice, all of the things that bring us into a calmer, grounded, socially engaged place with each other. And then we just keep track. We don't, in the typical model, you can easily fall into power struggles, right? How much did you drink and how did you get? And then it gets really awful and people don't want to do it. And trauma therapists don't want to do it.
Right.
But I'm really encouraging trauma therapists to, through the lens of the autonomic nervous system, appreciate that you must pay attention to addiction, because addictions are what's shifting those states. And we want to help people shift those states down into a ventral place. So if you're not directly dealing with what that person's doing to stop that shift, to stay in that place of flight, fight, freeze, and shut down, you're working at cross purposes. Do you get that?
I do.
Yeah. And that is, I think it's a serious problem. So I'm really wanting to invite trauma therapists to work with me around how we can, in a very different kind of way, be with these behaviors. We acknowledge that how adaptive they are, and it's kind of like taking a person's temperature. It's like, how are you doing with those today? Because it gives you information. How are you doing as a therapist? And how's your client doing in terms of how much they feel the need to stay in those behaviors, which is really a terrible place of freeze, right?
Right.
It's constriction with the sympathetic branch, and then it's collapse with the dorsal branch. And they're going crazy, really fast, nowhere. So we have to develop practices that help with those addictive behaviors in a very, it's a very tricky thing in a way, because you got to be compassionate and also very confronting at times, right?
The dance,
It's a dance.
the creative part of
Yeah.
it. Let me just reintroduce you. I'm speaking with Jan Winhall. We're talking about a lot of stuff, but her book is called Treating Addiction with the Felt.
And trauma, it's actually called Treating Trauma and Addiction.
Okay, pardon me. Treating Trauma and Addiction with the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model, a bottom-up approach. You kind of referenced this earlier on in our discussion, but where do you see trauma therapy now? How is the field, if I could be so broad, understanding it? Are we learning more? Are therapists understanding it more? Give me a broad brushstroke, if you would.
Yeah, I think so. I think that right now we're in a real transition with a real paradigm shifting tension that's happening. There's so much curiosity and excitement about polyvagal theory, right? Because we know that just working in the head with trauma isn't enough. We've known that for a while now.
Mm-hmm.
Bessel's book and Judith Herman's, those are beautiful books. I mean, they're just incredible. They're as good now as they ever, as anything, I think, written now. And there's lots of great books written now too, but we've known that for a while now. But I think it's growing in terms of the amount of interest in polyvagal theory and trauma. There's just so much excitement about that. And what does that mean? It means you're really shifting from a kind of a model with the DSM that's been constructed out of these different concepts of behavior. And then you get into all these problems about what's normal behavior and what's abnormal behavior, abnormal psychology. And, all of that can just be dismissed if we shift into a more body-based way. I think it's just a better system for understanding trauma, because trauma lives in the body, and we all know that, and not to say that I think some of those I think all therapies can be great. The framework that I've created in the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model is a generic framework. You can bring anything into it. It's basically just looking at two processes: interoception, which is the felt sense, and neuroception, which is the body's ANS. And that's what I did in the framework, is I crossed those. And then I brought in parts work, and you can bring anything in, EFT, all of these different wonderful therapies, focusing oriented therapy, any therapy, dance therapy, yoga practice, trauma informed, into this framework, which is embodied. And so I think we're wobbling between the two worlds. And what I often hear is that people are wanting to really learn more about this embodied way, but they're still using the language of the DSM and the disordered language. And we're kind of, I want us to understand that it's important to think at the root of what we're doing, right? Like,
Mm.
do those two ways of working go together? And they don't really.
Right.
They at the basis of them, they're based on different frameworks. So if we have just a very generic framework of the body and the ANS, we can bring all kinds of things into that. So does that kind of, yes, I think it's moving. There's so much more interest now. First, it came with yoga, with Bessel van der Kolk talking about yoga, right?
Right.
That was maybe 10 years ago or so, and everybody, oh, yoga, and which is fantastic. Now look we've got way more opportunities with different modalities, and the field of somatics is growing like crazy.
Yeah.
But of course, we only really need the field of somatics because we don't live in our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
If we really lived in our bodies, we wouldn't have a field of somatics that talks about how to work in the body. But we need it now.
So how are you working now? Are you seeing individual clients? Are you doing groups, workshops?
I see, I still see two clients a day because I just love it. But I'm doing a lot more training and writing. I love writing, and I'm doing trainings with the Polyvagal Institute, and I do courses where I teach my model and teaching it to anybody. It's not just for therapists. It's for the model you can use for anybody, learning how to listen to each other.
We're going to wind down here, Jan, and as we do, we'll obviously have your books up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. But in addition, I mean, you've mentioned a number of books. You mentioned The Courage to Heal, The Primacy of Human Presence.
That's a paper that Gene wrote in the little focusing book.
Genlin, yeah.
Just his Genlin's little focusing book. Beautiful, beautiful book. I give them away, honestly. This book it's remarkable. Yeah. And then also Steve's book. Now the big blue book that Steve Porges wrote scares people, but the pocket guide is amazing. Beautiful way as an introduction to polyvagal theory. And in my book, I write a chapter where I really bring 5 different lessons about polyvagal theory into the body. So how do we understand these concepts? How do we carry them in our bodies?
Awesome.
Yeah.
Jan, man, I love talking to you. Sincerely, you're so friggin' inspiring. So passionate. That's why I love doing this. And I get to talk to people like you. And I'm like,
yeah,
it's
well, we have a real chance now. We have a chance to change that. I do feel that there's a real awareness now of the power of safety and the primacy of safety. Everybody's talking about safety because none of us are safe.
Right.
So now we have a real opportunity, I think, to do even better.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to have you back at some point. And,
be great, Guy.
Awesome. Thank you so much for
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Bye.